Hi, and thank you for joining me for another short talk. And Motzei Shabbat, a friend of mine, Shimshon from Hollywood, suggested I should make a video on how one does Judaism. In other words, apart from just giving an overview, hopping into the dynamics of doing Judaism, i.e. Torah and Halacha. And when he mentioned it to me, I realized that I've never really hopped into it. I've never really given an overview on how one does Judaism, the actual steps, a systematic theology of what we do and what we believe. Many people have heard me say, all you need is a Torah, i.e. a Chumash or the 5 books of Moses, and Halacha, which are the rulings of the court. The great court, the Sanhedrin, the elders, the men of the great assembly, they've gone by many names. But specifically the court that God himself said that he was going to put on them what he put on Moses. And the transmission of authority, which ended around the 4th century of the Common Era, which gave these individuals the authority to develop civil and ceremonial law for the Jewish people. As it states in Parshat Shoftim, that if you disagree with them, or if you disobey them, it's like you're disobeying God. And I think that's really a good place to start. The idea of a Chumash and Halacha. A Torah, and essentially a Mishneh Torah of the Rambam. Now you're probably wondering, why specifically the Rambam? When there are so many works dealing with Jewish law out there. From the Torah, the Rosh, the Rif, Shulchan Aruch, Mishneh Berurah, Kitzer Shulchan Aruch Harav. There's actually a handful of modern day supposed codifications out there that are gaining popularity. Works like Sharei Halacha, Yalkut Yosef, the works of the Ben Ish Chai, the works of the Chazon Ish. It really seems almost never ending. And here, this area is really where I really want to help in. So, back to the Chumash and Mishneh Torah. Friends, the basis of everything we believe is the Torah. Not Tanakh or Nach, what Christians call the Old Testament. No, it's the 5 books of Moses, and everything that has come after that is only there to amplify the initial message, the commandments, the mitzvot, within the 5 books of Moses. And this is something that many people fail to realize, that even the words of the Nevi'im are not there to add anything new to our theology or to our mitzvot. The job of the Navi was only to bring Israel back. Israel that lived in and around the life and time of that prophet, their job was to bring them back to Torah. And that's it. Never to add to Torah. Even the Torah itself says that if a prophet permanently adds a commandment or permanently takes away a commandment, he's to be put to death. And this is really an area where those individuals who are new to Judaism fall into. Quoting Sefer Yeshayahu as reverently as quoting Sefer Shemot. No, friends, there's a huge distinction. Now, it is also true that the notion of divinely inspired scripture really doesn't exist in Judaism. In other words, you have Torah, and then there's everything else. So Torah gives us the base, and only allows us to build on it what it sanctions. This is very important, because the Torah does say don't add or take away from its instructions. Now, what does it sanction? Well, apart from the instructions within it, it sanctions the rulings of the court. And that's it. In other words, the only things that are meant to permeate Jewish life from generation to generation are the 5 books of Moses and the rulings of the court. What many later on loosely called the oral law. That's it. It's really so refreshing to be able to know what the Almighty expects you to do and believe, basically in one paragraph. Now, this is something that unfortunately you won't find many rabbis on YouTube teaching. I'm not saying that most rabbis don't teach this, because those in academic circles do in yeshivot, but for some reason, only rabbis who are super mystically inclined make their way onto YouTube. And no, this is not the way Mekubalim understand Torah and Halacha. But let's not lose sight of what we just said, and that's that the Torah only sanctions the instructions within it, and the rulings of the court or the judges, in scripture specifically known as the elders. So, if we would classify them as steps, step 1 is Torah, and step 2, and really the final step, are the rulings of the judges. And again, regarding the prophet, the job of the prophet, as it states in Deuteronomy chapter 18, that God will raise up for you a prophet once you begin to emulate the nations of the world, to basically bring you back to Torah. That's all they're there to do. And regarding books called the prophets and the writings, it was actually the elders, the court, the men of the great assembly, the Sanhedrin. These individuals, they were the ones who compiled, canonized, and many times wrote the books found in what we call the writings and the prophets today. So it still boils down to the Torah and the judges. This is why it never really made much sense to me how someone could be against the oral law or the rabbis, all these synonyms for the judges, and still hold books outside of Torah, specifically the prophets and the writings, as in some way validated enough or religiously endorsed for study, when it was the elders, the rabbis, the judges, the great court, who again decided what books to put in, what books to leave out, and like we said, many times even wrote many of the books. Now again, this leaves us back with just Torah and the judges. Now, the reason that books like the Mishnah, the Talmud, why Mishnaic literature is so important to Orthodox Jews in the Jewish world, is because here is where you will find the rulings of this court. In other words, these works act as a catalog of Jewish law. Now, you will find folklore and legend within all these works, but many times these midrashim or agadot are there to introduce a ruling, to introduce a halakha. But this is why the Talmud is so important to those in the Jewish world. Now, the way that the Mishnah and ultimately the Talmud was composed made it difficult for the average Jew to know what the final ruling was, unless that individual or their family had some consensus, some actual Masorah, i.e. a tribal understanding on how to understand many of the laws, specifically the ambiguous ones, the ones that appear without letting us know which way the actual halacha goes, or which rabbi or group won out in the debate. And it's true, this makes it a little difficult for the average Jew to know what the final law was. And this is why codification, and specifically the Rambam, and specifically the Rambam's work, was so important and necessary. Now, the Rambam wasn't the first codifier. I would say the Rif, if you open a lot of the older Gemaras in the back, you would find the Rif's codification, but that was only for Talmud Bavli. It didn't encompass all the halachot. While in Mishneh Torah, you had all of Jewish law in 14 volumes, something that till today, no other work has duplicated. Now, to recap, and I think this is something that I must do constantly in this video, friends, it's the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, and halakha. That is what a Jew must do and believe. Apart from that, everything else is optional. In other words, this is what makes someone a kosher Jew. And again, what we're trying to do here is explain how does one do halakha. Because Torah Shebiktav, the Chumash, the 5 books of Moses, are pretty clear cut. They are the basis. The books in the Torah are the basis. But again, how does one properly act it out? Now, what I'm telling you now is not in any way my svara or my chiddush. This is not something I made up. The Rambam, in his Hakdama to Mishneh Torah, in the introduction to Mishneh Torah, lays this down on how now that he's codified all of Jewish law, one doesn't have to study Talmud anymore to know what the law is. Because anyone who's opened virtually any Mishnaic work knows that it is full of agadah, i.e. non-halachic ideas and statements, what we call midrash nowadays. And essentially what the Rambam was doing was making your job easier by extracting all the laws from all these books. But back to Mishneh Torah. It is no coincidence that Mishneh Torah begins with the numeration of the Taryag Mitzvot, of the 613 commandments. But further than that, as mentioned by the Chasam Sofer, that Mishneh Torah actually originally came with Sefer HaMitzvot, the complete Sefer HaMitzvot attached to it in the beginning, not just the numeration, and that the only reason that we see them in two different works today is because the printers wanted to make money. And yes, I know that Sefer Mitzvot was written in Arabic and Mishneh Torah was written in Hebrew. That really doesn't make a difference. Or change the fact that the Rambam's work, Sefer Mitzvot, relies on Mishneh Torah, just like Mishneh Torah relies on Sefer Mitzvot. But at least, in the editions that float around today, we see that the 613 commandments are enumerated at the beginning of the book. Why? Because the Rambam here was setting up a strategy, a method of helping the reader not lose sight of the source, i.e. the mitzvot from the Torah, and the halachot, the practical implications that follow it. For example, in every book of halacha within Mishneh Torah, you will virtually always see this introduction, that this sefer contains so many mitzvot, so many positive ones, so many negative ones. It lists the mitzvot it contains, which really should be fresh in your mind because you just read Sefer Mitzvot or the enumeration of the 613. And then and only then does he begin to lay down the halachot that pertain to these mitzvot. In other words, he lays down the Torah law, and their practical implication are the halachot that follow it. And just check it out. This is how virtually every work of halacha appears in Mishneh Torah. From Hilchot Melachim, Hilchot Isur Bia, Hilchot Hishut, reminding us not to lose focus of the Torah, that the Torah is the basis, and all this are attempts to either interpret, act out, or better understand and illustrate Torah commands. And the reason this is important is because many people fail to make this distinction today. Not to mention that this methodology was lost in works like Mishnah Berurah and Shulchan Aruch. In other words, they just mention the halachot, bundled in with many mitzvot, and giving one the idea that a halacha is the same thing as a mitzvah, that a ruling from our sages carries the same weight or is essentially the same thing as a mitzvah from the Torah. And this methodology is really quite spectacular. In other words, if someone had a question on Pesach, they'd look at that portion of Mishneh Torah, which would begin with the mitzvot pertaining to Pesach as enumerated in Sefer Mitzvot. He would list the negative ones and the positive ones, and then he would begin to extract the halachot, or show how and why Chazal chose a certain practice or halacha, and how it linked to the actual mitzvah. Again, because a mitzvah is the commands from the Torah, and the halachot are the rulings or interpretations of the great court, of the elders, of the judges. And honestly, this systematic theology, I really don't think has ever been taught by any rabbi online. Not because they're hiding anything, just because they happen not to know. But I assure you, in more academic circles, this is always the way it's taught. Now, what's the ideal? Or what did they do before the Rambam? The real ideal was to be able to extract halachot straight from the Mishnah. And honestly, once someone is proficient with Mishneh Torah, it would not hurt him to go into the Talmud, into the Mishnah, and see how a lot of these halachot were developed. And you know what? Possibly even disagree with the Rambam's understanding or Masorah. That's fine. There's many rabbis today who go into Talmud Yerushalmi and see a different understanding. No, friends, the reason I'm a big proponent on Mishneh Torah is because it's a great basis to begin and even remain, because it does cover all the halachot. But that does not mean that the Rambam is the final authority. Because, like we said, the basis on how to do Judaism is the 5 books of Moses and the rulings of the court. Now, it's true, if you would hop into the Mishnah or Talmud Yerushalmi or Talmud Bavli, you'll notice that sometimes the din, the ruling, is a bit ambiguous. Pretty much because these ideas, these rulings were never really meant to be written down. Halachot were meant to remain fluid, oral. Why? Because a halakha that was developed today could have been essentially annulled tomorrow. That's the power that the court had, men with actual smicha. But since the dismantlement of the Sanhedrin and ultimately smicha were forced to decipher what the actual halakha was from the notes they left over. And this really goes for all of Judaism. Judaism does not make so much sense outside of the land. Today, what we're living is Galut Judaism, exile Judaism, which is why in many cases, a lot of the laws in the Torah have been mystified to apply in an exile setting because they don't make sense outside of the land. Even the notion of schar ve'onish, of reward and punishment. According to the Torah, punishment perhaps is not getting rain in its proper season, not seeing your children grow old. Now, punishment is hell, some metaphysical place of torment. While in Torah, these themes took an agrarian sentiment, something we can't relate to today. And friends, the reason I'm mentioning all these different ideas is to help rein in and limit what we call Orthodox Judaism today. Because honestly, it's out of control. Mainly because people have failed to understand the system that I'm presenting you today, and have in turn hijacked Judaism by introducing so many optional practices and beliefs, humrot, stringencies, metaphysical ideas that they teach are obligatory to believe, including the plain Agarata, all the folklore and legend that appears in the Talmud. Many times they have a problem distinguishing between that and what appears in Torah itself. How many times have I heard a rabbi say he's quoting the Chumash when he's really quoting Rashi? No, friends, what makes our religion sophisticated are all the distinctions and separations within it. We have a hierarchy, we have a systematic theology. And ultimately, what really makes a religion sophisticated is how many optional beliefs it claims to have. In other words, Judaism has a lot, but a lot of it is optional to believe. And that aligns perfectly with this ideology of separation that I'm laying down. Now, this is something that religions like Christianity and Islam don't have. In other words, there are no optional beliefs in those belief systems. If you happen to disagree with an idea of one denomination, they'll condemn you to hell, and then you just go to a different denomination. Well, in Judaism, it's fine. You're free to believe whatever you want. However, you're not free to exclude others from the Torah covenant if at least that person holds on to the principles of that Torah covenant, which are the 5 books of Moses and halakha. That's it. And really, that's all. Friends, for more information about everything Jewish, please visit TorahJudaism.com. Thank you.